This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Shendlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we're counting on you.
And we're very pleased today to welcome Sari Bashi. She is a human rights lawyer and an activist with expertise in international humanitarian law and Israeli policy towards the occupied Palestinian territory. She's the author of Makluba, Upside Down Love, which is published in Hebrew, and she also writes the Forat blog, which is www.2msforat.com. Sari co-founded Gisha, the leading Israeli human rights group promoting the right to freedom of movement for Palestinians in Gaza. She served as its first executive director, and she's currently working as an advisor to Human Rights Watch. Full disclosure, she's also an old friend of mine, colleague, and the person who tagged me with the running bug, long-distance running bug. We're going to be talking about her new book, which I just mentioned, called Makluba, Upside Down Love, published by Asya Press in April of 2021. Sari, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the basic premise of the book. Lots of people are in mixed relationships across the conflict divide or across racial and ethnic divides, and many of them try to keep it quiet. But you decided to write a book about your relationship across the Romeo and Juliet lines. Why did you decide to do this publicly?
It's a great question because it's actually something that I've been struggling with for a number of years. And the decision to publish the book is something my partner also has been struggling with. So for many years, after I met my partner, who's a Palestinian resident of Ramallah, he actually was a client of mine. So I was a Jewish Israeli lawyer. He was a Palestinian client, and we fell in love. For most of that time, I kept it secret for a variety of reasons, privacy, but also I was worried that it could be used against Gisha. I had security concerns, and also it's actually a lot of pressure to be interesting. And I didn't really want to be interesting in that way. At the same time, I started writing the book about 10 years ago because there were stories that I wanted to tell. And particularly, I wanted to tell Israelis in the sense that when you cross over to the other side, when you live in the West Bank, when you love somebody who's Palestinian and subject to Israeli military control, you see things in a different way, in a human way, but also in a different way politically. And I wanted to be able to share that with an Israeli audience. So the decision to write the book was different from the decision to publish it. I wrote it, and then after many, many years, I decided to publish it.
How was it different, and why did you want to share it specifically with an Israeli audience and not a broader international audience, and therefore you wrote it in Hebrew and not in English?
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, I think I was just writing. I didn't think it would be a book. And the book itself is comprised of, to some extent, of anecdotes that are then strung together into more of a narrative, but that came much later. I just wanted to write down what I was experiencing. And I'm fluent in both English and Hebrew, but I think the decision it wasn't really a decision. I just started writing, and I just started writing in Hebrew. And I think it did reflect the fact that I did want to communicate with the people around me. And so to some extent, the book is about what happens in Palestine, but it's also about what happens in Israel. So a lot of the book is also talking about what it's like for Israelis to be interacting with the occupation, sending our children to the military, living in bubbles like Tel Aviv, but knowing that that bubble comes at a price for other people. And so I'd be happy for it to be published in English as well. And I'm working on that for a broader audience. But it really is an attempt to tell a story that I think Israelis know well, all too well, but from a different perspective. And that's the story of how Palestinians and Israelis live together.
Speaking of the other perspective, your partner's name is part of the book. I mean, his name appears in every alternating chapter, but not as an author. Was that on purpose? Did he have less of a kind of drive to publish this book in his name, or even his pen name?
So the book is a true story, but I used literary tools to tell it. And one of the literary tools is creating a dialogue between the two characters. So the book is structured as alternating chapters, each chapter in the name of the two characters, one being myself, the Sari character, and the other being my partner. And the name that I've given him in the book is Osama. And so it's an attempt to really tell the story through two perspectives. My perspective as an Israeli who's landing in Palestinian society and being exposed to a different aspect of Palestinian society through my relationship with him, and his exposure to Israel in a different way. So as a young man, he was in Israeli jails. As a young man, he worked on Israeli construction sites. But he's now, his relationship with me reintroduced him to an Israel that he hadn't been in touch with in a long time, and to a different Israel, an Israel of my friends and my family who, in some cases are different than the soldiers and contractors that he knew as a young man. And so in the book, we're both discovering. And so the two voices is an attempt to give voice to that discovery, that mutual discovery.
Well, what did he have to say about the way you represented him, his voice? I mean, after all, you wrote it, and as much as you're familiar with him and with the situation, you're still not Osama and not a Palestinian and not a man and not him.
Yeah. Look, I mean, first of all, I have to give him a lot of credit and gratitude for supporting me in publishing the book. It's my story, but it's also his story and our family's story. And I think because of the power dynamics that exist between the two of us, that publicity puts him at greater risk than it does me. Because as a Palestinian, he's more vulnerable than I am as an Israeli Jew. And just in terms of preferences, I think he has less of a public-facing agenda than I do. And so he not only supported my publishing the book, he also helped me. So in that sense, I think the chapters, they've been vetted carefully with him. And he's well aware of what I said. And of course it's my words, but very well informed.
Okay. Now, when you said that he managed to kind of have a look at Israel in a different way than his previous experiences, how much was he able to see of Israel, given how constrained he is in terms of entering Israel proper, Israel sovereign? I mean, is he experiencing Israel in the same open way that you're able to experience the Palestinians? Or Palestinian society, I should say?
Absolutely not. I think one of the themes of the book is really the difference in power dynamics. And that was something that was very hard for us just as a couple, as two people who love each other. The difference in my level of freedom. I could go see him in Ramallah whenever I wanted to. I could go to the sea whenever I wanted to. And he and I have a shared love for the sea. He grew up in Gaza in the Jabalia refugee camp right next to the sea. I could see my mother whenever I wanted. And when I met him, he hadn't seen his mother in 12 years and couldn't see her. And so that difference was very pronounced, and it was hard. At one point, in the book, he says, if I can't come to her in the middle of the day and eat falafel with her, how can I make this relationship work if we have this imbalance? And so he, for most of the book and for most of his life, he hasn't been able to enter Israel. But his relationship with me forced him to be present on the seam line between Israel and Palestine. So in the book, there's a chapter where I go running in the Ben Shemen forest outside of Tel Aviv, and I lose my car key. And the spare key is in Ramallah with Osama, and I need to get it back. And he can't come to see me. He can't come to bring me the key. And so we have this elaborate plan where he goes to the edge of Road 443, which is off limits to Palestinians, to bring the key to an Israeli taxi driver. And in that journey, he's forced to come closer to the apartheid. Because when you live in Ramallah, you can, just like in Tel Aviv to some extent, you can live in a bubble where you don't see those differences. And in physical ways and also in more subtle ways, my relationship with him forced him to the seam line. Another issue that came up in the book and in our relationship was my friends and the fact that they do reserve duty. So the people that I love, the people that I care about, could be the same people stopping him at a checkpoint and not letting him cross, or even worse, removing him to Gaza, which was his biggest fear. And how can he reconcile his love for me and his desire to accept my friends with his fear of soldiers participating in an occupation that hurts him and his family?
You're now talking to us from North Carolina, where you are based temporarily. And I wonder whether it changed your perspective in one specific way, and that is that you've realized how life is so much simpler there for a couple like you. And maybe you would want to stay longer, or maybe it occurred to you even before that, and out of some sort of political statement, you decided to stay in Israel-Palestine.
It's a great question. So I think we experienced that wonderment at being normal the first time we left Israel-Palestine. And that was when we went to South Africa several years ago. And it was strange, but we could drive the same car. We could lawfully live in the same house. If somebody asked where we were from and we told them, it was, oh, that's nice. And then they moved on. It was amazing. It was normal. It was beautiful. And since then, we've gone back and forth. So we've been in South Africa, back to the West Bank. We were in a different part of the United States and then back. I personally want to continue living in Israel-Palestine because I feel like there's work to be done there, important work to be done. And too many people leave. Too many people who are troubled by some of the brutality and oppression that go on for very understandable reasons leave. And in an ironic way, I'm actually more protected than some of my other left-wing Israeli friends. It sounds a bit strange, but when Osama and I got together, people kept saying, oh, but that's so hard. That's so hard. And what I wanted to say is actually, to some extent, it's a lot easier. My children will never go to the army. My children will not be educated in a system that teaches them Jewish supremacy. I've protected them from that in maybe a non-traditional way. But I have many friends who have left Israel because of their children, because they can't protect them. And that's another theme that I talk about in the book, this pain that parents feel, knowing that they can't stop their children, and especially their sons, from going into the army, and they can't protect them from what they'll experience and from what they will do to others. So in that sense, I actually have more of an ability to be in Israel-Palestine. For my partner, it's different. He doesn't have the privilege that I have. And so we will go back at the end of the sabbatical, but I don't know what the future holds for us.
But I'm a little bit curious about what you mean, Zari. I mean, if you're saying you're protected in that sense because your children won't have to go to the army, I assume what you're saying is that if you decide, both of you, to live in Israel-Palestine, you will not be the kids won't be drafted, or they won't, or maybe you'll live in Ramallah. But does that mean that they're free of, the kinds of conflict generating attitudes around them in school, for example, which you also mentioned? If you were to live in the region, whether it's in Tel Aviv or Ramallah?
So I think my kids, the one thing that I can be pretty sure about is that they won't have the privilege to be racist against Israelis or against Palestinians. They're mixed. Their identity is so blended that it kind of makes it really difficult for them to adhere to stereotypes or to hateful images of the other.
On the other hand, they could be victims of that kind of racism on both sides.
Yes,
exactly. Like, what if they're in school in Israel, they'll be taught what you have called just now Jewish supremacy, and if they're in Ramallah, they'll probably be taught Palestinian nationalism.
Yeah, although I would distinguish between the ills and dangers of Jewish supremacy and Palestinian nationalism, a lot of that having to do with power. So Jewish supremacy is more dangerous than Palestinian nationalism because it's backed by a lot of violent power. But look, I worry about that for my children, especially my daughter. And I can mention now the column that I write in Haaretz and on a separate website under the pen name of Forat. Before I came public, I started with the pen name and I kept that. And in that column, I talk about my fears for my daughter, about what it'll be like. She and I speak Hebrew to each other. So what it's like to speak Hebrew in the West Bank, my fears for how she'll be treated, my hope that she'll be strong enough to manage. And there's a column that I write where I relate a story that happened about a year and a half ago when I was running with my son in the jogging stroller early morning, about 5:30 in a residential area. As I'm running, I see all of a sudden soldiers just about 200 meters outside of our house. And so I immediately turn in the opposite direction with my son in the stroller to run away from the soldiers. And then I get hit with a huge blast of tear gas. And so I'm running with my son, he's 2 years old. I'm trying to protect him from the tear gas, get him as far away from there as possible. And later on, when I tell this story to a friend of mine in Tel Aviv, he says, are you sure you want to live there? You're not protecting your kids. And he has a son who's 6 months older than my son. And what I wanted to say, but of course I didn't say it, is, yeah, I don't want my son to inhale tear gas, but at least I know he's not going to be the one throwing the tear gas in a residential neighborhood. At least I can protect him from that. And so many Israeli parents can't protect their kids from that. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's my situation.
Speaking of parents, one of the secondary character in the book is your father. Who is an Iraqi Jew who came to Israel in the early 50s, just like so many of his community, and later left for the US where you were raised. And even though, half a century later, he never shed his Jewish nationalism. And I'd like to ask you whether first of all, your activism, but also your personal life and your attachment to this piece of land, as you describe so well in the book and now, are all these an answer to your father or maybe a polemic with your father?
It's a great question.
I mean, Gilad, by the way, we should say, Gilad's not just being Freudian. You do explore a lot of these questions yourself in the book. We should say that.
Absolutely fair enough. So I like the question, and it has two parts. And one is my activism and the other is my connection to Israel-Palestine. And so my connection to Israel-Palestine, I think, is part of a connection to my father. So growing up, my father and I didn't have much to talk about, didn't always know how to talk to each other. But he did share with me a strong sense of place and love for Tel Aviv, for his family in the Tel Aviv area. And he left Israel in his early 20s, which is the age at which I came to Israel. And I think I came to some extent partly to explore him. And I did. I went to the same Friday night dinners at my uncle's, his brother's house that he went to. I hiked in the same places. I swam in the same sea. I ate in the same restaurants. And it was a way of getting close to him. My activism is a bit different. I should say my father has very conservative and hawkish views in general about everything, I would say, most things. And I have very dovish and left-wing views in general about most things. So we see things very differently. But I don't think that my views were necessarily a reaction to his. We weren't a particularly political household. We didn't talk a lot about politics. And I didn't start holding left-wing or dovish views about Israel-Palestine. As a child, I was taught that the Intifada, the first Intifada, I was a child during the first Intifada, I was taught that it was part of a history of anti-Semitism. And that just as the Nazis killed Jews and the Inquisitors killed Jews, now the Arabs were trying to kill Jews. And that's what I learned. And I didn't question it. It also wasn't that important. I wasn't a political person. And it was when I was older and I went to Israel myself and I worked as a journalist in Jerusalem that over a long period of time, I just saw that the reality was different, very, very different. And so I came to hold the views that I hold now in response to information and observations. And those views are still evolving and changing. So no, I don't talk about politics with my father. And it's a painful subject for my father and me because our perspectives are so different. But I think we do come together through a connection to Tel Aviv, to the sea, to different parts of his life in Israel, which he's left behind.
Speaking of connections between the relationships in the book, between your connection to Israel, Palestine, and your father, there's another connection I'd like to ask you about, and that is the connection with running, which is a big part of your life and a big part of the book, and is a great metaphor for both what you do, but also one of the real asymmetries in your relationship with Osama, because you run these long, long distances, and he spends his entire life up until the book opens with him leaving for London. Up until that moment, he's barely been able to move anywhere. And so tell us about the asymmetry of just your kind of the experiences that shaped you in terms of who you are. You're a person who likes to move. He's a person who can't move. Is that an irreconcilable asymmetry in your relationship?
Or maybe just a very good metaphor.
Well, it is a metaphor, not just for my relationship with Osama, but also for my human rights work, because both of those really are not just a long distance run, a marathon, but an ultra marathon. And I'm an ultra marathon runner. My longest race was 216 kilometers in northern Israel that I did back in 2012. 33 hours. Teaches you a lot about humility, determination, about knowing where you are, even when it's not where you'd like to be, and planning your steps accordingly. So when you're in the first hour of a 33-hour race, you have to restrain yourself. You have to be modest and humble. And when you're in the 20th hour of a 33-hour race, that's when you have to push and let go and just push as hard as you can. So it's a great metaphor for life. But in terms of Osama, one of the things that was so apparent when we first met was what he calls his geography being messed up. So over the course of his lifetime, his world became smaller and smaller. First, he could no longer travel between Gaza, where he was born, and the West Bank, where he worked and came to build a life. And then even within the West Bank, with the walls and the checkpoints, he could no longer travel from place to place, to the point where he didn't know where villages were, even when they were right outside Ramallah, because the checkpoints made it such that it was hard to get to them, and also even hard to figure out where they were, because the road was so winding, you got lost and you lost your sense of orientation. And that's one of the reasons that I find it so instructive to do long runs in the West Bank, because when you're running through the area, you can see where you are, and you can also see what the restrictions have done, what the checkpoints have done. So I always run in quote unquote Palestinian areas of the West Bank. I run in the areas that are permitted to Palestinians, because that's how you can get there from where I was living with Osama. But in doing that, you see the settler roads. There's often jeep patrols as well. In the book, I also talk about being turned back by soldiers who were called by members of the settlement who were troubled by seeing somebody crossing those invisible barriers. And so as a runner, I also have the privilege of being able to pass through different areas that are close to cars because of the checkpoints, and that are also close to both Jews and Palestinians, because they don't cross those seam zones. There's enclaves that are Palestinian, and there's settlements that are Jewish, and there's not a lot of interaction.
I think that what I was trying to really figure out from that question is, given the very asymmetrical experiences that you both had in your lifetimes and that you currently have, if you're in the region, is there a way in your personal and private life, which is the heart of the book, I'm not just being voyeuristic, to build a symmetry and equality within the relationship, despite the fact that your present realities are so unequal in terms of what you could both do and where you can both go or not go?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that he and I struggle with and deal with day to day in our relationship is the question of privilege. And a lot of that is just about acknowledging it. So, for example, the decision where we should live, whether to stay in Israel, Palestine, or to go somewhere else, that's his decision, because I have privilege. I can manage in all those places. When we live in Israel, Palestine, I can access the best healthcare. I can have a job and be well rewarded. I'm safe, and he's not. So if he makes the decision that he wants to leave, I respect that and honor that and acknowledge that as a way of taking responsibility for the imbalance. I can't balance.
But isn't your decision to live in the West Bank, in the Palestinian area, in a way, an attempt to forgo that privilege?
No, absolutely not. I bring my privilege with me. I'm safe. I could get a COVID vaccine with the rest of the Israelis. I can go to the Kupat Cholim, which is excellent if I need to. I can go to the sea. I can take my kids to the sea because they have Israeli citizenship. He can't. We had a brit for our son at a friend's house in the Tel Aviv area, and he couldn't come. He couldn't get a permit. So I bring that privilege with me, and also in more subtle ways. I live in a society where I can write a book that probably annoys a lot of people, and I'm still relatively safe. That's not the case for Osama. He lives under military occupation. There's a lot of restrictions, and it is not equal. So my project with him is not to make it equal. It's not. My project with him is to acknowledge that there is a power imbalance and to build our relationship a loving, respectful relationship, bearing that in mind. And I don't think this is unique. Lots of couples have power imbalances, whether somebody makes more money than the other, or, I mean, there's many different kinds of power imbalances. Ours is just mirrored by a political power imbalance that is comprehensive for Palestinians and Jews.
Is his decision to remain anonymous part of this? Response to the difference in power balance?
Absolutely. I'm safe and he's not.
Tell us about your children. I mean, you tell a lot of stories also in your blog about explaining to your children who, are very small or were very small when you started writing all these things, exactly what's happening around them and why it's happening, but in ways that a child can understand. But your children are not tiny now. They're growing up. You can remind us of their ages. How aware are they of the boundaries that shape your life, Osama's life, and your life together?
I don't really know, because the one thing I've learned is that my kids are much smarter and much more observant than I can possibly anticipate. What I can say is that the experience of answering my daughter's questions, I started writing the blog when she was about 5 and she's now 7, has actually been incredibly instructive for me. Because when a child asks you something, in order to answer, you have to boil it down to its simplest and truest essence. So when she says, what's the occupation? What's a checkpoint? What I told her about checkpoints is that the checkpoints are there because the people who stand there are having trouble sharing. And they think that only some people can pass. And so they don't let Baba cross the checkpoint. They'll let us cross the checkpoint. But Ima and Baba think that they should share and that everybody should be allowed to cross and that the land belongs to everybody. So when you think about it, at its depth, occupation and apartheid and colonialism are about an inability to share. They're about more than that as well. But the questions make me, they ground me. In terms of what she understands, I mean, it's interesting. We've been here maybe 9 months, and in her school in North Carolina, she's learning about Martin Luther King Jr. She has books also talking about slavery, about Harriet Tubman, a freedom fighter who freed many slaves in the South. And so I'm curious what connections she'll start to draw between different kinds of oppression in different parts of the world. More and more, she's becoming aware of it. And the one thing I love about the way she incorporates information is she'll ask me what the facts are. And then she'll say, do you agree with that? With the understanding that people have different opinions. And I hope the understanding that she can have her own opinion.
Now that you actually live with a Palestinian and you actually experience in person all these restrictions and other challenges that you had dealt with professionally as a human rights lawyer, how does it make you feel about the prospect of a better future for both Palestinians and Israelis now? I mean, did your perspective change because of that, or was it just in line with your worldview before?
I think maybe one of the biggest realizations that I had from my relationship with Osama was understanding the depth to which Palestinians feel insecure, the depth of risk and security threats that they face. So I met Osama when I was the director of Gisha, which is an Israeli human rights organization that promotes the right to freedom of movement for Palestinians in Gaza. And Gisha does a lot of public messaging among the Israeli public. And one of the things that we always do, appropriately so, is acknowledge Israeli security concerns. And I think I spent so much time acknowledging Israeli security concerns. It made me less aware and less sensitive to the much deeper security concerns that Palestinians feel, to the level of, I'm afraid I'm going to approach a checkpoint and get shot because a soldier is going to be nervous. I can be plucked out of my home at any point and removed to Gaza, where I haven't lived for 20 years because the Israeli military doesn't want to change my address in my ID card. I can be arrested. Our neighbor, while we were gone, our neighbor was arrested by the Israeli military in the middle of the night. So in our building, the soldiers just came and just plucked him out. He's a nice 35-year-old guy with 3 kids. That kind of insecurity is extremely deep. And I wasn't as aware of it until I got together with my partner. In terms of prospects, I'm wildly optimistic for a better future, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take a deep process of decolonization, of picking apart the power dynamics and the inability to share. Because at the depth of it, what I would like to see in Israel-Palestine is a totally different kind of society and regime, one that's based on equality and dignity, and also restitution for what's been done to Palestinians.
And is that what kind of a constitutional arrangement or territorial arrangement do you envision, or do you not want to choose one?
There's lots of different arrangements that you could have, but I think decolonization is the essence of it. And decolonization.
But what does that mean to you? Yeah.
It means that for Israeli Jews, it means that we find a way to live in Israel-Palestine, not as colonists, not as oppressors. So we pick apart the privilege that Israeli Jews have. We pick apart the cultural domination, and we find a respectful and respected place for ourselves that also acknowledges what has been done to Palestinians and what is still being done to Palestinians, and dismantles it. It dismantles those systems of oppression.
We have a few minutes left, and I want to ask you maybe what could be a tough question, maybe not. What was the hardest part of this book for you to write? I'm just going to tell you one of the things that made me ask myself that question, which was a small chapter in which Osama is explaining why he's angry. It's just called anger, or I'm angry or something. And he starts out by apologizing to you. And that to me seemed like it would be a hard thing to write. What was the hardest part of this for you in terms of themes to express?
It's a good question. Maybe the hardest part was talking about this pain of distancing myself from my family, my friends, where I'd lived. You know, I moved to the West Bank, and I left behind a lot. And there's a chapter where I describe packing up my apartment in Keramet Manim near the Carmel Market in Tel Aviv, and taking this life that I really loved. I loved living in Tel Aviv, and packing it up in a way that really there was no return. Because realistically, my partner is not going to be able to get a permit to come live with me in Tel Aviv. We've been trying for years. It's not going to happen. And so that's a door that I had to close. And writing in the book made me realize that it is closed.
Well, Sari Barshi, author of the new book, Makluba Upside Down Love. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And also big thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to our producer, Ariel Cohen. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind, good, bad, or ugly. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has well over 700 interviews. And please like us on Facebook, follow me and Dalia and the Tel Aviv Review podcast on Twitter. And of course, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.